Good afternoon, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you to the awards portion of the 14th Annual F. Scott Fitzgerald Conference. Montgomery College is absolutely honored to be hosting this amazing conference for this 14th year. And why do I call it amazing? I think of some of the literary giants who have honored or we've honored or who have participated in the conference during the past 4 years. Some of them include William Styrone, Joyce Carol Oates, E.L. Doktorov, Norman Mailer, and the list goes on and on and on. And so it's been a delight for me to get to meet and hear from people I've read over the years, and then to come into some of the sessions as I can as time goes on. During the day, I know you've been greeted by a number of people from the college and the city of Rockville, and this afternoon I want to acknowledge the presence of two very special guests. We're very fortunate to have the ambassador and his wife from the Dominican Republic who have joined us today, and they're sitting over here. This afternoon's session will be especially a pleasure when we welcome Julia Alvarez to the Rockville campus for presentation. And for her presentation, her work is read widely by our college faculty, students, staff, and of course by the community. And we're very privileged that she will be here today. A quote that is often attributed to her is, "A novel is not, after all, a historical document, but a way to travel through the human heart." And of course, so much of what we read impacts our human hearts, and that's what makes it so great. In many ways, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Conference is also a way to travel, a way to journey among the wide array of literature that explores and celebrates our humanity. Through genres like poetry, biography, fiction, children's literature, screenwriting, and the short story, we learn so much about the world. And sometimes, if we look at popular science fiction, about another world. We have a science fiction fan here, very good. The conference is a collaborative effort led by the energetic and tireless, and I won't say old friend, John Mosier. And so we owe special thanks to John for his steadfastness with this conference. So John. It really would be hard to imagine the conference without John presiding. You met Carolyn Terry, our Dean of Humanities at the Rockville campus earlier today, and she has also been part of it, as has Julie Wakeman-Lynn and countless Montgomery College faculty and staff who have been here throughout the day. This is a wonderful community event, and as I look around, I see members of the community, I see our students, which is wonderful, I see our faculty and our staff. I think that F. Scott and Zelda would be very proud of us for coming together and talking about the issues that we do today. Before leaving the podium, I want to also make sure that you read in your program the wonderful sponsors. A conference like this doesn't take place without the help of the sponsors from the community, from public, and from our private sources. And sponsors, you make this truly happen. All opportunities to celebrate literature are very good ones, so this has been a day well spent. To quote author Barbara Tuchman, "Books are humanity in print." For those of us who love books, reading, writing, and thoughtful discussion, this is a wonderful way to spend a day. It's even better, really, if it were rainy, and we got the rain today. Welcome again to Montgomery College. Thank you for your support and participation, and we look forward to sharing many cultural events here at the Rockville campus with you.
All right. I want to now do one thing. Ambassador, if you could come on up here. I don't know what it is, but we're going along with an old South American custom. We have a little gift for you for being here. So if you can come on up, and we'll give it to you right now, please. Thank you.
Like me and my wife.
Don't expect them to be good. By the way, I do want to say the ambassador took time out of his busy schedule to come down here. He brought along his wife, Mrs. Saladin, who's sitting over there. And we also have with us the consul of the embassy, Mrs. Caceres, I'm sorry. Somebody should have given it to me phonetically. I would have been able to do a better job. But anyway, we're delighted that you were able to come here today and watch us give the award to Julia Alvarez, who is without a doubt one of the crown jewels in the Dominican Republic. And if you'd like to say a few words, it'd be absolutely super.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here because, as you may imagine, for the Dominican Republic, a writer, a personality like Julia Alvarez, and certainly make us very proud in the Dominican Republic. She is a Dominican American, and as she stated in the letter of invitation, she spent the first 30 years of her life in the Dominican Republic. Later, as many families that have to fight against the dictatorship, the Trujillo's dictatorship, their family left Dominican Republic, but thanks to the generosity of this great country, America, really. She has a career that has been, well, internationally well-known today. For us in the Dominican Embassy, for President Fernandez, the President of the Dominican Republic, the name of Julia Alvarez, her husband too, her family, make us really very proud. And we, one of the largest diaspora, 1.6 million Dominicans, no official data, by the way. Maybe the census, the 10,000, the census next year will tell us finally how many Dominicans we are in this great country. But at the same time, the Dominican Republic has very special links with this country, not only because of Julia Alvarez or Oscar de la Renta or Junot Diaz, because part of the happiness index of the U.S. is tied to the Dominican baseball players. To have 84 baseball players in the American and National League is algo that makes us really very proud. So thank you to the Montgomery College for this award that is a very renowned award to Julia Alvarez. I was just remembering her that we met a few years ago through the Dominican Week in the U.S. in the Museum of History in New York City, but we met later in the Inter-American Development Bank when you presented your book about Camila Enriquez. We met at that time too. So thank you very much for the invitation on behalf of my wife, the other member of the staff of the Dominican Embassy, Carolina Cáceres, and her husband, who happens to be German.
We've been having a long
I know that. So thank you very much, and certainly for us, I repeat, it's a great honor to be here sharing this afternoon with you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this is going to be kind of a difficult task, although I think he's well up to it. Blake Robinson, who is the executive director of Roundhouse Theater, and Blake, I'm probably leaving something out of your title, is going to introduce formally, he's going to introduce Julia Alvarez to us before receiving the award. As you know, Roundhouse Theater did the world premiere for how the Garcia girls lost their accent. Blake, come on.
Thank you, John. Well, it's my great pleasure to be here to introduce this afternoon's honoree. As you know, Julia Alvarez is widely regarded as the most critically and commercially successful Latina writer of her time. Born in New York, of Dominican descent, she spent the first 10 years of her childhood in the Dominican Republic. She rose to prominence with such novels as How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, In the Time of Butterflies, the list goes on and on and on. That's what the book flap wants to tell you about Julia. Here's what I want to tell you about her. First, she's a Vermonter. She lives on a little dirt road called Sheep Farm Road, right down the street from where my parents used to live, not far from Middlebury College, where she still teaches. Before I knew her as an author, I knew her as a neighbor who has to chop wood and scrape the ice off the front of her car just like everybody else. Second, she's a very generous and collaborative person. 2 years ago, I called her up and asked her if she would allow Roundhouse Theater to adapt her novel, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, for the stage. Not only did she agree, but she collaborated with our playwright, Karen Zacharias, to bring these wonderful characters to life for you, our audience here in Montgomery County. And as a theater director, it was my privilege to direct that production, one of the most memorable and cherished experiences that I've had thus far. Finally, I think it's important that you know that she grows a killer cup of coffee. Julia and her husband, Bill Eichner, who's right over here with her, operate Cafe Altagracia, a sustainable organic coffee farm in the Dominican Republic, where they use the proceeds to bring literacy and education to the people who work and live in that community. And I have to tell you, the Java tastes great. You can order it online, and it's really, really good. How cool is that? So those are just a few little extra morsels, and now we want to get on to the main event, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of my special friends and heroes, Julia Alvarez.
And it says, F. Scott Fitzgerald Award, having once found the intensity of art, nothing else that can happen in life can ever again seem as important as the creative process, is presented to Julia Alvarez for outstanding achievement in American literature by the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Conference, October 17, 2009, Rockville, Maryland. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Woo, thank you. This is wonderful. I'm flabbergasted. I'm speechless. I'm glad I wrote something down. I'm very, very honored. Thank you, John Moser. John is a very wonderful organizer, and he has a military background, and I soon realized that when he told me that he would meet me at the airport at 13:38. I said to my husband, I thought they stopped at 12. So I had to do the math and figure it out, but the airlines don't observe military time, so we were not here at 13:38. Thank you, John. This is a wonderful honor, and I'm very pleased to be here. I looked at all the other honorees in the past, and I feel a little bit like Obama getting the Nobel Peace Prize. Like, wow, but I'm not gonna say no. So, thank you. And you know, if we ever get cocky, if we ever think, well, maybe I deserve it, every time we sit down to write, as those of you out there who are writers know, the paper or the screen teaches you, you know, you've got to, beginner's mind, you got to start all over again. So it's great to get the affirmation, but you also just makes the work all the harder. Have to keep going. So thank you for this award. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming. John, for organizing it. So many people whom I've met that have worked hard to make this possible. And I know how these things are because I've done them before at colleges where I've worked, how much hard work goes into putting something together. So thank you very much. Great panel as well. Afterwards, I thought, well, maybe I'm not going to read my speech. Maybe I'll just get up there and go ditto, 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 like peanut butter, jelly, ditto, ditto, dito, ditto. But anyhow, I will talk to you a little bit about my journey to become an American writer. And I also put together a PowerPoint that keeps you awake in case you should fall asleep. There's some pictures, so that should keep it a little lively. And I just thought I wanted to talk a little bit about this journey of becoming what I now call myself, if I can find my glasses here, an all-American writer, using America as the hemisphere, of course. So, You can imagine how thrilling this is for any writer when readers gather around the little campfire of her books to celebrate the fact that she has written them. And I do like to think of storytelling that way, a circle gathered around a warm, glowing center of our common humanity, sharing that warmth and connection together. So it is thrilling for any writer to have her work honored in this way, but how doubly thrilling for me, having come such a long journey to this moment. In 1960, as a 10-year-old immigrant girl from the Dominican Republic, from a whole other culture and language, I never thought that someday I would become an American writer, that someday I would receive an award named after an iconic American writer like F. Scott Fitzgerald, that someday my books would be in a library a few shelves away from his, just above Emily Dickinson's, beside Louisa May Alcott and Jane Austen. I remember first encountering F. Scott Fitzgerald in high school, where we read The Great Gatsby. I must have been 16, 17, or as I used to think of it back then, 6 American years old, 7 American years old, dating the time that had elapsed since we first arrived in this country in 1960 when I was 10. If you wonder why I did this, it was to give myself a break. It seemed all my classmates knew so much more than I did, especially, of course, English. But it made me feel better if I thought, well, they had 16 years of total immersion, and I've only really had 6. I was still unsure of myself in this new language, but I had become a reader, and I was already dreaming of someday being a writer. Anything I read painstakingly, word by word, as if it were a poem. Why this word and not another? Why vivacious and not lively? Why amiable and not friendly? Why courteous and not kind? Why start a sentence with a prepositional phrase and not straightforwardly with a subject and verb? Inside the dark house, the girl called for her mother. The girl called for her mother in the dark house. It's scarier the first way. Why was that? How to get 2 characters to have an intimate conversation at a dinner party and not lose the sense of intimacy, but still give the atmosphere of a party. Fitzgerald was good at that. By the way, I once heard Robert Stone say that the hardest paragraph to write as a writer is the one in which you try to get the character in and out of a phone booth. You know, it's the little technical parts that are sort of hard to do. Needless to say, I was reading in this way, so I was a very slow writer. But one of the things I was doing by reading in this way was that I was trying to find a loose thread I could pull that would make the thing come apart so I could see how it was made. What happened was a wonderful 6th grade teacher gave me a list of books. She sent me to the library. A librarian helped me. I checked out the books and took them home and read them. I brought them back and checked out some more. I was becoming a reader. I had come from a poor country where few people could afford books, to own books, no less read them. A culture where there was no such thing as a public library. It was also a dictatorship where reading and books branded you as a dangerous intellectual. There was only one official, censored, approved story, broadcast on the radio, written in textbooks to memorize. In school, we were taught not to think or imagine or discuss, but to parrot back, learning by rote, the opposite of the winged life you enter in the world of stories. New York, 1960, I became a reader. I sat down at the big circle of storytellers, an inclusive place, a protected space. I experienced the world according to others. I dwelt in possibility, as Emily Dickinson claimed poems let us do. I learned how to navigate my way in the real world because stories gave me a craft in which to sail and a grand narrative of adventure. My 6th grade teacher not only encouraged my reading, she told me to write my stories, my own stories. Those aunts and uncles, tías y tíos, boy and girl cousins, primos y primas, I was missing so much, write them down. Tio Percio, with his long straggly beard and his one glass eye that spent the night in a glass of water and his extra 6th finger, write him down. Old Chucha and her stories of the Siguapas, a tribe of beautiful women who only come out at night to hunt for food and no one can ever track them down because they have a secret. Their feet are on backwards, so their footprints are always going in the opposite direction of where they had come from. Write that down. The taste of guavas, the smell of the ocean, the feel of the tropical sun like a warm blessing on my head. Write that down. I did. I wrote down my little stories, and everything I had lost came back. Not only that, the world around me changed as well. When my teacher read my stories, her face softened. She smiled, enjoying herself. When she read my story out loud to the whole class, those very same bully boys who had spit at me and thrown stones in the playground and called me Spig and told me to go back to where I come from, turned around to look at me. For a moment, they actually saw me as real. Nothing human was alien to them, not even a little brown-haired, deeply tanned, skinny Hispanic girl with a heavy accent. I had discovered something important about stories, their power to transform, to stretch the muscles of the imagination, which are the same muscles missing stories. I discovered a little poem that meant a great deal to me. I Too Sing America by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. That was music to my ears. I understood what Mr. Hughes was saying. He was claiming his place in the chorus of American song, an America that was still not listening to him, still treating him as a second-class literary citizen, sent to the kitchen of minor writers, instead of allowing him a place at the table of American literature. But no matter, Mr. Hughes knew that tomorrow he'd be at the table. And the fact that his poem was in my textbook proved that he had been right, that it was possible. This was an important voice for a young girl of another culture and language and background with a heart full of dreams to hear. Of course, it was a long journey between reading that poem by Langston Hughes in a high school anthology and publishing my first novel, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, in 1991 when I was 41 years old. Often people ask me, well, what kept you going? Maya Angelou says the bird doesn't sing because she has an answer. She sings because she has a song. I sang because I had a song. I wrote because by then writing had become a way of life, not a job, not a career, not a profession, a path to fame, money, self-importance, but a calling, a way of life. It has been a long journey for me, one that began listening to the world's best storytellers in another language, in another country, one that began in a bloody, repressive dictatorship where I first felt the freedom that comes from entering the world of the imagination. In 1960, the path changed radically. We came to the United States. I landed in a hostile playground, but I was lucky, a librarian, a 6th grade teacher. They looked at me and they saw possibility. They imagined this day for me back when I couldn't imagine it for myself. For me, the best thing about this journey has been to be able to follow my calling. But it's what I wish for every student that comes through my classrooms, not fame, not fortune, not publication, but the opportunity to follow their calling, to be able to do your true work in this world. But once you do, unlike Gatsby, the point is not to keep it, and live apart in the gated community of your good luck. In that respect, I believe more in the Toni Morrison model of giving back. She has a wonderful quote that goes like this: "The function of freedom is to free someone else. Service is the name of the game, serving with what is your talent, giving back to your human family to ensure that those who are coming after you get the same opportunity." And all of you who are teachers, librarians, who are doing this every day in the front lines, I mean, the most important work in the world. Our salaries don't reflect it, but hey, you're doing it. So thank you. I'm very honored, and I'm done.
Now it is a privilege to announce the winner of the high school contest. The winner is Mithili Mondadi, who speaks with the contemporary voice of American youth. With a fresh humor, Mithili has outlined the stresses of what it means to be a 21st century teenager, and I really enjoyed her story, its voice just really leapt right out at me. So, Mithili,
First of all, I just wanted to thank all the people who helped me with my writing. First of all, to my parents, who have been so supportive, and even though they thought it was a little bit odd for someone who was really into math to suddenly strike out into writing. And also my friends who read all the copies of my unedited work and didn't laugh at me when it was really bad. I got the idea for this short story mostly from my grandmother, who visited us in the last few years. There was a little problem with me adjusting to her at first because there was a language barrier. I'm not as fluent in her language as I pretend I am. But she told me that she had a child marriage in India when she was really little, like about 10 years old, and apparently in India it's really in to get arranged marriages now because all my cousins are getting married and we're getting a whole bunch of wedding invitations. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting if child marriages still existed in the 20th century, which we like to think is the modern world? And that's where I got my idea for Asha, who finds out at a party that she apparently has been married to this boy since she was 3 years old. I got my idea for her mother from mostly the fact that I'm Asian, and there's a lot of stereotypes about Asian parents, most of which aren't true, but some of which do have a basis in fact. And I just wanted to, Asha's mother is sort of the epitome of the ultimate Asian parent, sort of really focused on grades and not really into what her daughter really wants for herself. And although she isn't based off anyone in particular, she's sort of all the negative aspects of all the parents I see who, although they want the best for their kids, sometimes don't succeed in the right way. She's sort of like comic relief for Asha's really intense life, and the way she's so extreme about everything, I think, is a little bit funny. Asha herself was mostly based off of a typical Indian girl. I find that there's not a lot of literature about young girls that are Indian in America. I mean, there is a few, like, I don't know if any of you read this, but Born Confused is actually a really typical example of an Indian girl. But I happened to notice that there wasn't a lot more literature about people like me. So Asha is sort of a paragon of a high school student. I mean, she's good at everything, and she definitely is going to get into the college that she wants. But she's still really unhappy, and she's searching for whatever is going to complete her, which I guess all of us are really looking for in the end. But she happens to find it in Karim, who enters the story in a sort of peculiar way, telling her that he's her husband. And she doesn't buy that at first, but she finds that even though arranged marriages are a little bit old-fashioned, she might be able to make this work. And that sort of comes from my mixed opinion of them. And I think the funny thing about how I wrote this is I wish I could pretend that I had the idea for this when I first heard about the contest, but the ideas I had were a little bit laughable, and I was sort of reaching the end of my string as the deadline was coming close, and I didn't know what to write about. And I went to the 4th of July fireworks with my family, and there is an Indian festival called Diwali, which is the Festival of Lights, and we usually light firecrackers. And I was thinking about that, and that's sort of where I got the premise, because this entire revelation in her life happens on Diwali, which, interestingly, is today, for real. So happy Diwali, everyone, and thank you so much.
People who know me and my work understand that I write and publish both realism and experimental fiction. This is my 3rd year judging the contest, and my previous selections were fairly conventional in presentation, though more unusual in terms of subject matter. This year, 2 of my final 3 were more experimental in nature, but the winner, Jane Delurey's story, The Carrier, is a bittersweet but too true parable about motherhood and letting go and mortality. My mind goes blank. I can't even read my writing. In the end, I picked The Carrier because it was a fable with European flair and a flat delivery that takes on parenting and aging and mothers and is filled with the sort of wisdom I find in Grimm or Singer. And the combo of repetition and retro delivery, the idea that the modern baby carrier box can inspire this, plus gem-like bursts of musical language and magical imagery, make it soar high above the clouds. So, Jane Delurey, congratulations.
And by the way, before I let you talk, just want you to know we consider this first prize so important, we award $1,000, which I think is considerable too.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. This is perfect. If my picture gets taken, I'm blushing, so I'll have some color. It's lovely. I'm so happy to be part of this fine conference and to be sharing this microphone with the wonderful writers Azara Nafisi and Julia Alvarez. The podium is still vibrating from the keynote this morning. I know a good deal of work must go into planning and rolling out an event like this one, and I want to thank the conference organizers. I first attended the F. Scott Fitzgerald Conference when Grace Paley received the Literary Award. I came with a friend of mine, a poet, and we loved the seriousness without pompousness and the intelligence of the conference. Then I had another child, and I don't seem to have gone anywhere since. In fact, this is the first time I've left my house since 2006. I came today with another friend, Christine Grillo. Chris, would you stand up, please? Christine is a wonderful writer and editor. She's the person who receives my midnight emails with attachment. The subject heading, help, the message, please read this draft. She's seen The Carrier so many times, I'm sure she has it memorized. And I'm glad she could come here with me today as a guest of the conference. Thank you as well to Richard Peabody and to the editors of the Potomac Review. A few weeks ago, I had the chance to do a reading for the Potomac Review. I loved the atmosphere of the office, all that energy and commitment to good writing. The door locks automatically behind you, which is complicated when pizza arrives for the interns. This gives a top secret important feel to entering the place. I'm going to one-up Virginia Woolf and say that all writers should be possessed of a room with a locked door that requires a badge held only by the writer and perhaps a pizza delivery service. The Carrier is from a collection of stories that I'm writing that take place in a part of France that is very dear to me. My husband's family comes from there, and his grandfather, René, who died 2 years ago, kept a vegetable garden at the edge of a forest that is not exciting by any measure except that of my imagination. When I was living in France in my 20s, I would peel away from the delicious but endless meals prepared by my husband's grandmother. I left after dessert, just before coffee was served and the deck of cards was set on the table. I was never good at games, and I exported this inability to France. I walked through the garden to the forest, where I inevitably got lost, the nice kind of lost, with no real risk. In fall, René accompanied me with his mushrooming basket. He told me the names of the trees, how they were selected for harvest. Just as in his garden, he showed me how he kept the slugs off his endive and what mash looked like. René was a communist and a retired schoolmaster with a ramrod back. He was opinionated, and one of his opinions was that the United States was a failed political and cultural experiment. He allowed himself to like me because my grandparents were from Ireland, which made me, in his eyes, not really American. We had little in common, and I was a stranger in that forest behind his house. But I found my stories there, and I'm still finding them. I've widened the pond into a lake, I've run a river, I've built the mill that appears in the Carrier. The anecdotes that René told me about drowned boys and poachers have grown into stories, and new characters keep showing me their faces through the trees. Now one of those stories is in your hands. I hope you'll read it and enjoy it. I don't expect you to keep it preciously as I will my copy, but when you discard it, please do recycle it, or perhaps more appropriately, compost it. Thank you.
When I was called and offered the considerable honor of doing this job, sitting with these distinguished writers, appearing before this distinguished crowd, I did what I always do when I'm offered a wonderful opportunity. I said, no. That's kind of the story of my life. However, I always changed my mind, because what happened was I was told that the topic was border crossing. And I thought, well, what do I know about that? I've been around the world and so on, but still, all of a sudden, my penchant for metaphor, which caused a couple of severe arguments with editors at the New Yorker, which doesn't really like metaphor or similes or figures of speech of any kind, but no need for me to get bitter here about that. Anyway, my metaphorical tendencies took over, and I thought, borders, Barnes and Noble, borders, what is writing, particularly of the sort of writing that these people do, but crossing borders all the time. In your poem, Merle Collins, about your grandmother, who grows up in the Caribbean, and it's written in this, you convey the beautiful accent we all love so much, with your grandmother talking, but her grandmother was educated by the English and the Europeans, and so she didn't learn any Caribbean history. She learned all about the history of the kings of Denmark or whatever, and she writes a poem about how crazy this is, and tragic, but also funny, and crossing borders. Her grandmother was forced to cross borders, and she's hauling her grandmother back across the border and insisting that she stay there, but you start off in Grenada, you end up in England, now you're here in Maryland, and Lord knows where you'll be. Borders. Okay, we next have Olga Grushin, who is, as she told me, she is not Russian, she is Russian. She warned me about this, that I had best pronounce it correctly. That's my best effort. I can't do any better than that.
That's great.
And who writes about someone in Russia who decides to basically cross a border by selling his soul, really, and then coming to disaster by getting everything he wanted. Then we have H.G. Carrillo here at the end, who, well, here's a line from Carrillo. Señores, for the few of you that joined the party last night, and for those who would like to join us on the other side now, it's a thin membrane that you all use to get to the beach or to the arms you rest in right now, or to another morning, another time, in another place. Borders. He says membrane, but I think you're meaning a border of sorts. We're always crossing borders. What I'd like to say, I'd make an accusation, is that you're no different than any other writers. I don't care where you're from. I don't care what exotic knowledge you may have of other cultures, that basically you're in the same business as any of the greats that I've just mentioned, and they were doing the same thing that you are. Now, tell me why I'm wrong or why I'm right. I like a fight. Yeah, don't you? Sure. We're all a little sleepy after lunch. Let's get the adrenaline pumping. Who would like to talk about that? Somebody talk. I'm going to call on you.
You're calling on me, all right.
Yes.
Why, you're right. You're right. You're absolutely right. In fact, I'm very happy to be put into the category of Melville and of James. These are authors. These are authors that, in many ways they were my teachers. You cross one border, I guess, to become an American author. You train yourself as an American author, and you join the ranks of American authors in that way. My foray into writing and my desire to write started out, actually, my mother had too many kids to keep track of, and too many lessons and practices and that sort of thing. So she basically had to drive us all around, and our deal was that if the Little League game was rained out, then I was to go to the library. So in the library, trying to be that sophisticated kid, I picked up Updike. And I read a story called The Music School, and this was actually my into it. Now, what does, a Cuban immigrant parents have to do with, whatever happens in Schilling, Pennsylvania? I don't know. To tell you the truth, red leaf sugar maples and the smell of girls in sweaters in football season, in fact, girls named Beth, were all exotic to me. These are exotic places, these are exotic ideas, these are exotic things. They remain exotic to me, but I've never read anything to find myself. I've always read to go someplace else, to actually have a journey.
What he's talking about is this ultimate kind of melding of things. You, in your poetry, fight for retaining a culture which was taken from you by the colonialists and so on. Doesn't that put you at complete odds with him?
Not at all.
I'm wrong? Are you telling me I'm wrong?
You're absolutely wrong.
You're wrong.
Because I think that melding is always there. I also think of where I began. My first interest in the word was really excited by, I guess when I think of it in an academic sense, by Wordsworth at primary school. And this was no exotic, out of the ordinary experience. This was colonial schooling. So that everybody in grade school did Wordsworth, did, for example, Wordsworth's We Are Seven. So kids that would be learning that, off by road during the weekend, etc. So this was ordinary, everyday experience. And I had to discover Caribbean literature later on. So that the Caribbean voice, in fact, was something that I came to value more when I went to the University of the West Indies, which is where I did my undergraduate degree, and met a Caribbean writer who was the historian Edward Kamau Brathwaite. And Brathwaite was particularly interested in using the voice in Caribbean writing, using the Caribbean voice in writing. So I go to university, of course, to do the Romantics and the Victorians. That's what I knew. And at university, at the time, my favorite poem was Hardy's The Darkling Thrush. So if anyone asks me to recite my favorite poem, I am saying I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey. And there comes Edward Kamau Brathwaite with his poem, The Dust, which goes, "Evening, Miss Evie, Miss Maisie, Miss Maud, Olive, how are you? How are you, Evie, child?" So,
do you find yourself fighting off the Grushin literature that you knew in your youth more? Also, to further confuse the whole thing, her father was a great teacher, professor of sociology, and which means that she can explain anything and nothing.
You would not have liked to hear that.
Well, that's a little prejudice. I was an anthropology guy, so we didn't like the sociology guys.
I see. Well, no, I think that I do see writing as sort of one whole. I don't really think of myself in terms of, I don't box myself in. I don't think, oh, I'm, Russian or American. And I just sort of think of writing as, I don't know, maybe a big sea, and there are different bays or different streams within the sea, and I belong to the Russian bay, if you will, but it's still the same water that we all swim in, to me, and I grew up actually reading Russian literature, of course, but also American literature. We had this wonderful set in translation. I remember these maroon covers and golden lettering. Fitzgerald. I loved Fitzgerald when I was 15 and 16. I read everything I could get my hands on in Russian, of course. And it was thinking, I always knew I wanted to be a writer from basically the time when I was 4 or 5 and I started reading and writing. I come from a family of writers, a very long tradition of mostly journalists, some fiction writers, so it was always sort of something that I knew I would do. And I always looked at pretty much all the literature and all the books as something that I wanted to learn from and assimilate. French, American to some extent, early on, and then more so as I was growing up. So coming here, I started writing short stories which were not at all Russian in themes. In fact, what I really liked about writing is this freedom it gives you to imagine yourself as absolutely anyone. And I did not want to write about a young Russian woman in America. I wanted to write about, I wrote a novella about a Greek police officer on a small Greek island, which I knew nothing about. But that's what I liked, the sort of the freedom to inhabit anyone's world and imagine yourself in.
Something in Fitzgerald. Could we talk about Fitzgerald and what Fitzgerald has meant? And was Fitzgerald a border crosser? He always saw himself as an outsider, that he wasn't one of the rich boys that he hung around with, that he was an Irish Catholic, which set him apart from the WASPs. He was from the Midwest, which set him apart from the Easterners. And it's interesting that Nick Carraway, the narrator of The Great Gatsby, is very much a kind of a fantasy of the ultimate American insider. The Midwesterner for several generations, his family, they were in the hardware business, weren't they? How American, how wonderful. I always thought that Nick Carraway was a sort of dream of Fitzgerald's because he didn't cross any borders. And when he got a look at the other side, he wanted to go back to the Midwest and so on. But everybody else, was Fitzgerald a border crosser? Talk about him.
Well, actually, one of Julia's favorite books of mine is El Otro Lado, The Other Side.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately, to write, one is always standing on one side of a border and looking over, you're always in the position of being an observer. And so you're never actually quite contained in the group, you know, and it's not the kind of, you know, I think that when we talk about people coming from the Caribbean, people coming from Russia, people coming from other places, and then writing about a place that is one sort of border crossing, but it's also a platform to talk about other things. I think we ultimately end up as writers always in a position of border crossing. We're always in a position where we're observing and conveying what we observe. You know, I frequently tell my students, and just one correction, I don't teach at the University of Maryland, I teach at the George Washington University, contrary to any introductions. But I often find myself telling my students that the only thing that they have is their art is resonant in not any kind of freakish thing that they try to do, some sort of strange sort of abstraction, sort of something that they like to call style. It's not my style. I'm not working in my style. I think the only thing that you really do have as an artist, as a writer, is your place of viewing, your place of seeing, your place or your position of looking at things. And that's what you convey. That's what's original. That's what's fresh. That's what's interesting. And the more honest you can be.
Beside them, aren't you condemned? Maybe, my Lord, considering the amount of writers in the room, maybe we're all condemned to a life of being outsiders, of being strangers, of being unable to cross the border that other people go across. What do you think, Merle?
Well, the question makes me think of Derek Walcott, a poem by Derek Walcott in which he says, someone has to write your poems. In other words, it's a little bit, you know, the tone of it, he seems to be saying to the people the poem was really set in Trinidad, and he seems to be saying, okay, you want me to be a part of this big, great, happy family, but somebody has to stand aside and look at it all and write your poems. And of course, quite a few people were angry with him for that sort of response. But I think you say that I look at things and I'm sort of interested in the border crossings. I'm interested in border crossings, yes, in terms of both language and experience. For example, and it's always the other side. For example, thinking of Edouard Glissant, who are from the French Caribbean, saying that a lot of Caribbean writers tend to want to write what he refers to as the little histories, meaning that the large history is a fantasy of another people, but the little histories is what the writers from the Caribbean, you know, take on to speak about, meaning the everyday experience, the story behind the headlines. So that, for example, in 1983, I found myself wanting to write, and 1983 was the year of the invasion of Grenada. Mm-hmm. I found myself wanting to write another story other than the huge headlines about Grenada and the Soviet Union and Cuba. You know what I mean? I wanted to write sort of the stories behind that, which is where my novel Angel came from.
Maneuver the way you do. What do you have to teach us as people who have crossed borders? Is it that you can teach us that we're all border crossers? Is it that you can teach us that we should become border crossers? What do you know that I don't know? That's what I want to know. How about you, Olga?
Teach. Well, I don't really think of myself as a teacher. I think that each of us obviously knows something that other people do not. And thinking about this earlier question of being an outsider, I mean, to some extent, of course, every writer has this distancing. You know, something horrible happens to you, for instance, and it's horrible and you're in the moment, but there is a part of you that stands back and thinks, ooh, I can really use this particular feeling in me. So you know, that there is, of course, that, but I really think that, I don't know why, but for some reason, the notion of teaching makes me personally
Of what?
uncomfortable. Teaching.
Yeah.
I think more of just sort of reaching within my imagination and trying to build sort of my own world in the books, and hopefully.
Is that the one thing that counts the most? Being yourself obviously is very important, but as a writer, is it to just love words? Just the sheer love of language? Do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, and for me, actually, coming to a question of what is different about me, I think the language is different, and maybe that's what you've been trying to get at the whole time. But I do think that if there are writers who are, as you said, message writers, or who are philosophers who have something in particular that they want to get across, and I generally tend to dislike writers who do that personally. They're not my kind of writers. And then there are writers who are like Nabokov, who just love the joy of language, and who just play with words and different languages, and that's for me, not at the age of 4, of course, when I wrote, there was a princess and she lived in a forest, but later on that became, to me, probably the most interesting thing about writing, and then adding a second language to it and seeing how the two interact. I don't know if it's been also your experience, but for me, I find that a lot of my English sort of derives from my Russian, and it is different. I try to sort of write with English words, but with Russian cadences in Russian, because I do come from that tradition. And
Just out of curiosity, do you read Conrad?
I do.
Do you? I mean, sometimes there are just little idiosyncrasies in his English, which I think add a great deal to the music of it. Do you see that? I mean, do you identify with Conrad?
I tend to identify more with Nabokov, but
Nabokov.
Although
God,
his Russian books translated into English are my favorite. His American books are written in very American and very different from his Russian language. And for me, it's his own translations of his Russian books are to me the most wonderful.
What an extraordinary thing to translate your own book.
Well, his son translated them.
And what an extraordinary man. And of course, we are here under the aegis of a man who is one of the great musicians of the English language, who is F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I gather you all have sensed that about him. And so why don't we all give a big hand to not only them, but to F. Scott Fitzgerald and language. Language, language. God, isn't it wonderful?